Hello and welcome to Sao Paulo and special coverage of Bloomberg New Economy, New Reality, New Rules. I'm Erik Schatzker. We brought CEOs and government leaders together here to our groundbreaking event in Brazil because it's time to talk about the challenges they all face, urgent challenges. Our world, a world that was mostly stable and predictable for decades, has been transformed in just a few short years.
World of optimism.
Astonishing news from East Germany, where the East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore.
A world of interdependence.
Supporting China's entry into the WTO, it represents the most significant opportunity that we have had to create positive change in China since the 1970s.
Today's world is a very different place.
Ukraine under attack.
The January 6th attack remains a dark stain on our nation's history.
Chaos in Brazil as thousands storm the country's capital.
We're standing up against China's unfair economic practice.
A Cold War is brewing. Supply chains are breaking down. Inequality is starker than ever. Climate change is wreaking havoc. AI may threaten our very existence. There's no going back. This is the new reality.
Brazil, with its huge economy and vast resources, is playing a bigger role on the global stage as host of the B20 and G20 summits this year and COP30 in 2025. Brazil is helping to set the agenda. That's why we're here. One of the most critical questions for Brazil and every country in the global south is about alignment. Do you align with the US, with China, with the EU, or maybe with no one? Neutrality, non-alignment.
Well, it is a changed world for sure. We have to look at what the seismic shifts are under our feet in recent years. And you have to go to ongoing wars in the Middle East. You have to go to the rise of China. And I would say more recently, the rise of India. You have to say COVID was an accelerant. And so we're likely to see the devolution of really kind of a bipolar construct, although the US-China relationship will undergird everything that we see play out in the next few years. And we're likely to see regional groupings pop up because countries are not going to want to place their bets in any one particular direction. They're going to want to act on self-interest, as all countries do, which is to say, keep your options open.
Anna, how does today's world look to you? Does it look the same as it does to John Huntsman, or does it look different?
No, the world has certainly changed. But when you take a step back, you need to take a broader view to corporate strategy, country strategy, where there's always an element of your client base, your customer base. So by being non-aligned and presenting a neutral stance and demonstrating industrial prowess and competitiveness as a country, as a company, one can actually win by being the recipient of those investments. So I think there is a massive opportunity in showing that there's actually a third way, which is the non-polarized way, which frankly in politics that also should be the way, where, right, there's gotta be a way in the middle.
Wesley, how concerned are you about the conflicts, hot and cold, around the world, the state of divisiveness?
When we see, China and US, increasing, some disagreement or some...
There's tension.
Yeah, some tension. Of course, this is a concern, and I think it's a concern globally that, is the two largest economy global. China has a huge consumer base, and a lot of, especially in the food sector, China is a key customer to anyone that is in the food sector. So we do a lot of business with both.
Now, when you think about non-alignment, we didn't invent this in Brazil. Look at Europe, in particularly Germany. I take my cues from Germany, really. Whatever Europe does, we kind of follow because they have the same dilemmas we have, which is kind of being in the middle of a large trade partner, right, and a large strategic ally, such as the United States. And again, there's no perfect answer, because this is why the world is the way it is, this current revisionist state. We do the best that we can, and we're doing fine. Seriously, we're doing fine so far.
I've never seen a time in my career, decades in either public or private sectors, where the policy signals have been so ambiguous. And I've never seen a point in time where politics has been this dysfunctional. So you combine the lack of clear policy signals and the dysfunctionality in politics, and it's no wonder we're all saying, where do we go? What are the rules of the road? The WTO doesn't mean anything anymore. There's no digital trade agreement. So it's kind of the Wild West in a sense.
I definitely think that Brazil needs to be talking with everyone.
Non-alignment, in other words.
Not alignment. With China, with Russia, with the US, any country. And one of the problems that, country leaders need to be open to keep talking, even they have a disagreement. Because the worst thing is to close the door and to not keep talking.
I think the point that Wesley's trying to make and I'm trying to make is perhaps it's easier from our vantage point of being in a non-aligned country, but we see clearly that you can't leave the table, because once you leave the table, all hope's gone to finding the areas where you agree on.
So would you say this is a total repudiation of the economic system that has been the structure of the global economy in the last decades?
We have had a lot of trouble coordinating to do things. Like take trade. Trade is okay, but for years we're waiting another round, and it's not happening. So there are a lot of indicators pointing towards difficulties.
So a structural change that we still haven't seen. What's the format?
Well,
I think like trade barriers, you see a less global world. That's your view?
Mm-hmm. I would describe it, there are two major developments. One is on a geopolitical scene, we now, so to say, realize that we are still in a competition of systems, political and social systems, which for 20, 25 years, was a little bit buried under other priorities that we had. And now, after the pandemic, after the Ukraine war broke out, we, especially in the West, we realize, there is a competition of system. The second that we are seeing is more on the trade side. I think, to simplify it a little bit, we are back to a pre-WTO time. So we dialed back, so it doesn't mean there's no trade, but the mechanics that we are using and the relationship between politics and trade, we are back to more pre-WTO times.
So much less cooperation, much more friction, much more open conflict, all of this.
And utilizing a nation power to impose their own interest in trade and direct investment policies.
Even though Brazil could be potentially one of the sort of winners and examples in this new world, sitting between the two, US and China, we don't see a lot of money pouring in. Why not?
Yeah. The country is attractive on a long-term basis. I mean, we're going to need massive investments in infrastructure. Our rules are relatively stable. They're not perfect, but they're good enough to give people comfort of coming here and invest. And I think there is a lot of global money available to come here for these long-term opportunities. And at the same time, if you look at countries as large as ours in the rest of the world, and if you look at it through the prism of size, potential for growth, and institutional stability, we compare very favorably. So I think we're benefiting from the fact that there is, polarization and disputes over, large, China and the U.S. and and all of a sudden, we're here. I mean, we are, and we should be friends to everybody. I mean, I don't think we should pick sides. I think we should look what's in our best interest.
Coming up, China's expansionist agenda is running headlong into the U.S. right here in Brazil.
The Brazilian government is considering, we believe quite seriously, joining the Belt and Road Initiative. How would you feel about that?
You're watching special coverage of Bloomberg New Economy, New Reality, New Rules. I'm Erik Schatzker in Sao Paulo. The world's two largest economies are competing for power and influence in Latin America. China is already Brazil's largest trading partner, and Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative is flooding this region with badly needed investment and development. Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite discussed that standoff between the superpowers with U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor Jonathan Feiner.
What is the U.S. strategy as you see it to counter China in this region?
I guess I would start by saying this is a region that's going to make its own decisions, its own economic decisions, its own decisions about trading partnerships, about security partnerships. And the United States very much respects the sovereignty of the countries in the region and their ability to make their own decisions about what's best for their future. We've also been quite clear that we are engaged in a global competition with China, and that competition is at the core of the U.S.-China relationship, and that it's not limited to the Indo-Pacific, but that it's playing out in other regions of the world, including here in our own hemisphere. There was a narrative that I think that was prevailing when this administration took office, that the United States was sort of on the verge of being surpassed by China as an economic power, that United States influence was waning in the world, that China's influence was on the rise. I think those predictions have very much been reversed over the course of the last few years, in large part because of the partnerships the United States has built with key allies and key partners, including very much in our own hemisphere, and because of the investments that we have made in our own sources of strength here in the United States. And so what we're seeing play out now in this region, in Africa, in the Indo-Pacific, and in Europe, we believe very much is demonstrating the value proposition of working alongside the United States, working alongside the United States in the construction of high standard critical infrastructure, in pursuing clean energy policies, in developing advanced technologies. And we feel very good about our position in the region and about the value proposition we offer countries as they make these decisions about the partnerships they will choose.
Do you think there are things, though, that you could do in terms of amassing private capital and those kind of options that America could begin to fight back against this kind of development economics that China is practicing?
Well, one of the huge advantages the United States has, a force multiplier for the United States, and again, goes to this question of the value proposition of working with the United States, is our dynamic and robust private sector, unparalleled anywhere in the world. The United States doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund. We don't have state-owned enterprises that we can direct in terms of their capital flows or investment decisions. But what we can do is incentivize and work with our private sector to invest in areas of strategic significance and importance to us. And we see a demand signal for that investment all around the world, including very much here in our own hemisphere, and believe that there has been a lot of progress in that regard over the course of the past few years, and it's something we very much want to incentivize. It's something unique that the United States can bring to bear in terms of the scale and the scope and the sort of cutting-edge nature of what our private sector offers.
China has a palpably growing influence in this region. How are you thinking about that? Is the US directly trying to counter or respond to that rising influence?
Let me put it this way. I think in trade for a very, very long time, we've been concerned by the indications that we've seen of growing economic dominance of the PRC economy in the global economy, as represented by industries that have been grown strategically and intentionally, not just for dominance within the Chinese economy, but for global marketplace domination. We've seen that in steel, we've seen it in solar, we are now seeing it in EVs and batteries. And what I think is really interesting about today in 2024 is that across our administration, whether you're the US Trade Representative, you're the Secretary of the Treasury, whether you're the Secretary of State or the Director of the National Economic Council, we are all focused on this challenge of Chinese overcapacity, excess production, and the impacts that that is going to have on very open economies like the US economy.
The Brazilian government is considering, we believe quite seriously, joining the Belt and Road Initiative. How would you feel about that?
It's a decision for the Brazilian government, so I want to be upfront about that. Sovereignty is a very, very important aspect of what we are trying to preserve in the world economy, as well as openness to the extent that we can trust each other, and democracy too. So first and foremost, that's a decision that is entirely up to the Brazilian government. That said, I would encourage our friends in Brazil to look at the risks in today's economy through a lens like the ones that we are using, through an objectivity lens, through a risk management lens, and to really think about what the best pathway is forward for more resilience in the Brazilian economy and in the world economy.
E não nos interessa uma guerra fria, uma nova guerra fria entre Estados Unidos e China. Nós temos que buscar manter pontes. Nós somos nós só tem 6 países que têm relações com todos os demais países na ONU. Nós somos um deles. Somos um país que há 150 anos não tem guerra com nenhum vizinho. Então o Brasil tem uma cultura de paz, de diálogo, de relações diplomáticas, e a relação com a China é o nosso maior comprador. Nós temos que nos defender e temos que dialogar com franqueza e buscar parcerias para trazer investimento em infraestrutura, em setores estratégicos.
O Brasil não precisa criar contencioso com ninguém, nós precisamos e temos uma ótima relação com os Estados Unidos, com a União Europeia, mas também algumas medidas protecionistas que tentam ser nos impostas devem ser combatidas com ampliação do leque de parceiros comerciais. É este o fortalecimento dos BRICS, com responsabilidade. O Brasil acabou de tomar hoje medidas importantes com relação à adesão de novos países nos BRICS, porque atrapalharia essa relação harmoniosa. Mas fortalecimento dos BRICS, os fortalecimentos com todo o Oriente Médio e também com a Ásia, em especial com a China, é a oportunidade de superarmos as barreiras comerciais impostas e que tiram as nossas competitividades. Tem dinheiro, tem gente para consumir e o Brasil deve estar fortalecendo. Por isso, eu sou favorável a que o Brasil faça a adesão à Rota da Seda.
Coming up, bracing for the new reality.
The opportunity is massive if you want to take that step, but to do these things requires a massive bet, requires a lot of capital.
This is special coverage of Bloomberg New Economy, New Reality, New Rules. I'm Erik Schatzker in Sao Paulo. Trade barriers, technological disruption, environmental catastrophes. These are real and costly challenges for economies in Latin America and throughout the global South. But challenge can equal opportunity. Climate change is driving the energy transition. The decisions taken now will determine growth, prosperity, and sustainability for generations to come.
Are more companies actually looking at Brazil now, either to set up businesses or maybe to buy businesses here?
Yes, and I think that you can have some tectonic movements around that, and especially regarding the energy matrix that Brazil has. As you said, we have, depends on how you measure, 85 to 90% of the matrix is renewables, which means that we are a renewable, the largest renewable energy matrix in the G20, and especially with low subsidies, right? Because doing renewables in UK, it's possible, but quite expensive. In Brazil, it's not. And I think Brazil could be a global hub for data centers, for example. As you know, you cannot build data centers in Virginia anymore. You cannot build, or in UK, you take 2 years to link your data center to the grid. In Brazil, you have huge investment in transmission lines and renewable energy fully available, not expensive. And Brazil could be a very important hub for global data centers that will be needed globally.
What's interesting is Brazil's really a beacon for us. The reason we've invested here in Brazil is because we found that Brazil was a place that we learned a lot about how to bring renewable power to data centers that are powering AI in the cloud. We've got 8 billion of assets here in the ground in Brazil, and we're proud to say that 100% of our data center capacity is provided by hydropower. And so we really found that Brazil was on the front foot, not on the back foot on this issue. And the key to this really isn't about whether we can generate enough power, renewable power. The planet is generating enough renewable power. The real problem is connectivity. And how do you solve the transmission issues that exist in Europe and the United States? There is a battle plan to get there. It'll take time. It'll take capital, a lot of capital, and it also requires just thinking differently as an investor.
I think that the most important obstacle for financing towards the global south is the failure to see this transition as an opportunity. That we are not yet there, even if there are so many good examples of how much of an opportunity this is, how many new industries, new areas of work, new jobs can be created. We still don't see that this is being acknowledged everywhere. We need to get to economies of scale. And the only way that we will do that is with a massive deployment of these technologies everywhere.
Yeah. How do you think about overcoming some of the obstacles that are involved in thinking about investing in developing economies? And what also, just to add to that, do you think the government role should be in helping to attract some of those investments?
What stops global investors from coming into markets like Brazil and other undeveloped countries is volatility of currency, liquidity, and availability of getting debt financing on these projects, because the projects are so much bigger than they used to be from an infrastructure perspective. The opportunity is massive if you want to take that step, but to do these things requires a massive bet, requires a lot of capital.
We've been talking with Brazil a lot about COP30 that's coming up, and that'll be a very important milestone both for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Brazil has done some good pioneering things on mitigation. The deforestation, it's important that get under control both for Brazil itself and for the world. One of our best breakthrough companies is building a steel plant with partners in Brazil. So yes, agriculture innovation with Embrapa, Brazil is very strong. So it's fantastic, that the issue is a very important issue, and it deals with kind of the equity things that Brazil's been a global leader on.
That's just some of the compelling discussion and debate from Bloomberg New Economy, New Reality, New Rules. You can find much more at Bloomberg.com and, of course, on the Bloomberg Terminal. I'm Erik Schatzker in Sao Paulo. This is Bloomberg.